Welcome to the Culture Connection speaker series. I'm Michael Beckelhimer in Washington, D.C., and I'm talking with American professors of Russian studies about their insights into Russian culture and how they teach it in American colleges and universities. So this program is presented by the American Center of Moscow, which is supported by the American Embassy in Moscow. If you're watching on the American Center's YouTube channel, VK, or Telegram channel, please post comments and questions on those channels at any time. We'll be monitoring and we'll answer questions as they come in when the time is right. And for Russian subtitles, you can select closed captioning in Russian. So, Julia, hi. Today we're talking to Julia Chidaga, a professor of Russian at Macalester College in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Her life and work has been dedicated to opening a window to Russian culture for herself and for her American students and even the people of Minneapolis. And we have a lot to talk about today. And Julie, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about yourself. So that is my introduction to you, our esteemed guest. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much to the American Center for having me, for giving me this opportunity to talk about my work. So yeah,
great.
Thanks.
Sure. So I'd like to start with a little bit about you. You were born in Minsk, and Robert, if you want to bring up the presentation, you were born in Minsk, and your family moved to the U.S. when you were very young. So tell us about your need to reconnect with your native land, and how that led you to where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a very old, beloved family photo of myself, who's a younger child in the picture, and my sister and my mother back when we were in Minsk. And so, yeah, so we emigrated to the United States when I was very little, and I grew up speaking kind of a kitchen Russian and listening to the songs we loved by the bards like Vysotsky and the Nikitins, Alla Pugacheva. In fact, my sister might be singing a Alla Pugacheva song in that photo. So yeah, so I went to college with the goal of becoming a writer. I studied English literature, but I also really wanted to connect with my native land. But my native land was the Soviet Union, which didn't exist anymore. So I started to think of the language and the literature and the culture as like a virtual homeland. And yeah, and so I did a senior project as an English major. I translated a novella by the brothers Strugatsky, whom we loved in our family. There was a novella that I translated. I even got to talk to Buddy Strugatsky on the phone, which was really cool. I got his phone number from an emigre writer who was at my university at the time. And it was 4 a.m. I went to have buckwheat pancakes at the local diner to fortify myself. And I called Boris, and he was very kind to talk to me. I would say, I have this interpretation of your novel. And he would say, no, we didn't. That's not what we intended at all, Arkady and I. But it was still great. And he was very gracious. So yeah. And then I went to graduate school. I worked in Russia in the early 1990s. And I went to graduate school and became interested in literature and material culture, the relationship with each other. And I wrote my dissertation, which became a book about glass and the cultural significance of glass in Russia. And glass is this material that bridges art and science, which made total sense for me. I was raised by 2 scientists, a botanist and an engineer, who loved literature, and literature for them and culture for them was kind of a space of freedom. And then after immigration, it was this repository of memory. So yeah, and my parents are still amazing resources for me. I talk to them every week, and they have such an archive of songs and poems and jokes that they share with me and that I share with my students. So it enriches our experience for sure.
Are they in Minneapolis? Yeah. Where do they live?
They live in Florida now. They retired. So my father always wanted to go somewhere warm. So
yes,
that's where they are. Mm-hmm.
All right. So very, very. And when's the last time you were back in Minsk?
Oh my gosh, it was back in 1993. So yeah, so just when I was right after college, I worked in Russia, and I got to go to Minsk and see my old hometown, and and it was it was really powerful.
Was there any? Was there? All right, I have so many questions, but
Yeah,
one
yeah.
more question. So most of your research was in Russia, in Moscow. Was there? Was there? Did you try to find a way to connect anything with Minsk and with
Mhm.
Belarus, or was Russia just for you the native land?
Oh, that's such a great question. I would say I thought because I'm a Russian speaker, I mostly identified kind of more with Moscow and same, well, with Russian speaking, I guess, places. Because when I went back to Minsk, at the time, everything was in Belarusian. So the metro had announcements in Belarusian, and I went to the theater with my aunt. Everything, the news, everything was in Belarusian, which was to me, I could understand a little bit, but not everything. So that was interesting. I think I would say maybe in the last few years I've started to identify more as Belarusian. Some of that has to do with my favorite musical group, Malchat Dama, who are from, you may know, they're from Belarus. I learned about them from my students actually, and they always announce when they go on stage, we're the group Malchat Dama from the city of Minsk, and they're so proud of being from Minsk, and so yeah.
Um, that's cool. I find it so fascinating that you went back to that place, to the to Russia, Minsk, at a time when people there were trying to figure out what are the next steps, and you were going back there at that exact time in the early '90s to sort of
Mhm.
figure out your own story, which of all times and places to be, that must be hard to figure anything out in the early '90s in Russia. But let's move to your interest in material things. I think that's another very unique aspect of our conversation today and what you do. Normally, we talk about literature and film, and of course, we will today. But you come at it from this interest in objects, material objects. And you mentioned glass, but also mirrors, light bulbs, wooden spoons. And we're going to talk about those things. Why don't we start with, you mentioned the glass. Why don't we start with your search for the famous Zertzala, and what it meant, and what happened when you finally found it?
Yeah, so this is an object that I became obsessed with and wasn't sure actually existed when I was in graduate school. I started graduate school. I read this play from the 18th century called Yabida about judicial corruption, and it mentioned this object. And as far as I could tell from my research, it was a three-sided prism with the decrees of Peter the Great on each side and under glass. And I just thought, I've never seen one of these, and I didn't know, I couldn't quite believe it sounded so fantastical to me that they existed. So I went to Russia to do research, and I looked at glass objects, I talked to museum curators, but I wanted to find Zertzalo as well. And Zertzalo is an old form of Zerkala, meaning mirror, right? And the reason it's called that is because the first decree that was in, put into one of these was from Peter. They're all from Peter the Great, but there's this wording like all officials should have this decree in front of them like a mirror. And so kind of like a mirror for their conscience. So they'll always do the right thing and obey the government statutes and not take bribes and have this be like a mirror. So anyway, I was like, I thought these don't exist, but I traveled to a museum branch, filiale in the outskirts of Moscow in this faraway place. And a museum curator took me to a storage shed. And there, she opened the door, and in the darkness, I saw one of these Zertzala. I was so excited to see it in the flesh. So this is one that's actually in St. Petersburg in the Kunstkamera. And yeah, oh, and another thing I want to say about these is that you can see how lavish looking it is. The two-headed eagle is at the top with the crowns. So they were these very overbearing symbols of autocracy. So during the October Revolution, there was a wave of iconoclasm, and anything with Tsarist regalia was destroyed, and a lot of these were destroyed, so that not many of them are left. But fortunately, I found a few of them. And
Right.
that was my first article that I wrote was about these. Yeah.
And where has this appeared? I think you had mentioned that it appears in Dead Souls and some other,
Yeah.
but do they
Yeah,
even
so there
translate it into English?
Yeah, so they, these things, these Zertal, they show up in famous novels like Dead Souls, like Anna Karenina. And how do people translate it? They'll translate it as Mirror of Law, but so they're kind of hiding in plain sight. So when I wrote about these Zertal, I want to try to understand what they were and what they signify, and then how authors use them. Because I'm very interested in how in literature, the author takes an object and makes it signify, and creates meaning with it. So, yeah.
Okay, then on the topic of literature and objects, let's talk about light bulbs and your story about doing research and reading this Alesha novel or novella. Um, Talk to us about light bulbs as a form of technology and as a significant symbol in early Soviet Russia.
Yeah. So again, so in graduate school, I'm taking an exam, and one of the questions was asked me to analyze a passage from Zavist, the novella or the novel Envy. And in that passage, a character is making a speech, and he's comparing the epoch in which they live to a light bulb that's growing dim. I thought this is very strange, especially because at the time there was a lot of very positive discourse around electrification and Lenin's drive to electrify the countryside. And light bulbs had this affectionate and propagandistic name, Lampochka Ilicha, or like Lenin's little lamps. So I started to dig into that. I was also noticing these prominent references to light bulbs in literature of the time, like in the 1920s, by Zoshenko, by Platonov. So a lot of attention on these. So I start thinking about, yeah, how are light bulbs functioning? How are they actually functioning as a form of technology, but also an object carrying ideological symbolism in the early Soviet period? And um, and that led me, and so I'll say, like, overall, I have an article and I have a book too in which I talk about this. I became interested in the symbolism of light and how it's a very traditional symbolism of the divinity. And it becomes in the early Soviet period, when there's a lot of borrowing from religious iconography of the pre-Soviet period, a lot of borrowing of that kind of visual vocabulary. There's also then this investment of light imagery around anything connected to the revolution, including Lenin, including the leadership and other glorified figures. So there's this kind of attempt to create I borrowed this term from French scholar Jean Stravinsky, a solar myth of the revolution that he applied to talking about the French Revolution. I see something kind of similar happening in the Soviet case, where this imagery of light is starting to get used in official art to, create this glorified divine image of the transformation that happened under the Bolsheviks. So anyway, but my research on light bulbs led me to the Kremlin stars, because they're gigantic light lamps, right, made of ruby red glass. And so I wrote about them too. So in this, so I'm glad you have the red, the star in color, and then the next to it is an image from a book that was really great, that I found, written by an engineer whose job it was to do repairs on these stars, which was very dangerous. They were so lofty. He had a description of how one time, and engineers had to do constantly, they had to do maintenance to these stars, because all kinds of, they would get very hot, and the bulbs would need to be replaced, and they would need to be cooled down. So once there was this terrible storm, and the men who were repairing the light bulb, they had to cling to the star and they covered the openings in the star with their bodies. And it's this incredible image of pathos and like emotion, that they were trying to protect these stars. So I could just say a couple more things about it. Two breakthroughs I had in my research. One came again from my parents. So I said to my parents, I'm researching light bulbs. And they started singing the song called Vdolь Dерevny, or Through the Countryside, that they both knew was a popular song in their youth, about how light bulbs come to the countryside and transform it. There's this line, "У каждого звезда под потолком." Everyone has a star under their ceiling. So it's this imagery of wonder. And another breakthrough was reading Pravda from the 1930s on microfilm, and just seeing how journalists were writing about the metal two-headed eagles that were being removed from the Kremlin towers. And what was put in their place initially were stars that were metal covered with semi-precious stones. But that only lasted for like a year and a half, and they were taken down, and then instead they were replaced with these glass stars. They had to glow from within. That was really important to the leadership at the time.
Well, I was going
And
to ask you that you're finding this connection of this symbolism of light and glass, and Soviet power, electrification. Were they thinking of it in those terms as well? So you said that they actually replaced those the the original stars with these glass ones that would glow. What were they? What did they want to portray with that?
yeah, that's a great question. And so, yeah, the metal stars with the semi-precious stones, they would be lit by floodlights from outside. But then, yeah, the decision was to have stars that glow from within, that revolve, so they can
Oh,
be seen from every angle. Yes, so literal revolution, I
they
guess.
don't do that anymore.
Yeah, I at the time, this was one of the demands. But yeah, they had to glow from within. And when you look at the language being used in the newspapers and poetry of the time to talk about these stars, there's first of all this idea that um, we are so powerful, we Soviets, that we put new stars up in the sky, right? These stars are joining the stars that are there. And that's how, that's like a divine, right, kind of power to be able to put new stars in the sky. And there's literally downright biblical discourse, like that I found in this one poem that was published in Pravda around the time, where the stars are burning without being consumed. So it's like this image of the burning bush from scripture that's again being borrowed and invested into those stars. So that's I found a lot of that kind of thing. And then there's a poster folks may know by Dimitri Moore called Christmas, Rождество, and where it's kind of shows two processions, sort of people from the old world walking in one way and people from the new world. The old world, they're walking toward the Star of Bethlehem, and the new world, they're walking toward the red star. And it says underneath, there's a poem. It says the red star of Bethlehem is sort of, I mean, sorry, the red star, right, uh, is brighter than the Star of Bethlehem. So it's this kind of rivalry between
Oh,
them.
that's so interesting. I mean, we know what it's like to walk on Red Square at night and see those red stars. It's very moving and powerful. Of course, now that I know that they were spinning at one point, that, that changes the image slightly.
It's a
Um,
little whimsical, yeah, I don't know, but
I know.
yeah. Mhm.
Um, so another object that you have done research on, wooden spoons and other such wares that have been made in Russian towns and villages and collected at the Vernissage, the old Ismailovsky market in Moscow. Tell us about your project to use these objects as a window into Russian culture.
Yeah, I love this project. It's a work in progress, but I'll say a little bit about it. So my former professor from grad school invited me to come with her in 2016 to Russia, specifically to Moscow, to do research at this market. And she and I are both interested in material culture, and we went. So the market is called Vernissage in the Izmailovo neighborhood, and so we came to the market. We talked to people shopping there. We talked to the artisans there and people selling these incredible wares. Um, and said, we're making an educational resource, a website for English speakers to be able to look at. It's kind of like a virtual exhibition of particular objects that they have this peculiarly Russian quality to them, and we want people to learn about Russia through things. So we put it to people that way. They're really enthusiastic and supportive. And so, for example, there's a photo here of a woman named Yelena who's surrounded by all her Hachlama wares. And she and I talked for a while. She is a retired teacher from Nizhny Novgorod area, and she comes from a family of old believers. And she was convinced that I came from old believers too. I said no, but we do have a spiritual affinity, definitely. She told me the story of how she once saw people dressed in the traditional costumes of old believers came to her stall, but they're speaking English. Turned out they were from the United States. And actually, in the United States, there are places like Alaska and other places where there are large communities of old believers still. Um, And one of the origin stories of Hachlama, like if you can see, the blue spoon was the one I purchased from her, which was kind of an unusual color scheme because usually there's a lot of red. But this, she said that that color scheme had become more popular in recent years, and so she she sold one to me. But you see how it looks like it's gold, right? But it's not actually using gold. It's using like linseed oil or flaxseed oil. And a kind of chemical reaction happens when it's heated and it creates this shiny gold um, appearance that was originally actually used also in icon painting. And so one of the origin stories of how Hachlama style came about had to do with old believers who were finding refuge in the forest from hiding from persecution and continuing their crafts and wanting to make practical things that they could use and they could also sell for a livelihood. And so it was so interesting to read that, and I tried to convey that in the information on the website. So and you can, yeah, and so here, cool, there's other things on the website show that here's how Hachlama is showing up in contemporary context. Like there's a limo that was actually not far from the vernissage that I photographed with the Hachlama image. So people get Hachlama tattoos, which I've been tempted by that myself. There's an arts and crafts kit too. And then the cartoon, it's cool because I hope we'll talk about political cartoons a little later, but this is kind of a very old political cartoon or agitational maybe poster. And it says один с ложкой, семеро с ложкой, or one with a plow and seven with a spoon. And it was a kind of a revolutionary, a Tsarist-Era revolutionary poster or image talking about how the peasantry's feeding all the wealthy classes, but everyone's holding their spoon waiting to be fed and exploiting the peasantry. But I included that in the website because I wanted to talk about how do spoons, because I talked about the Hachlama spoon, but I wanted to talk about how else do spoons signify in Russian culture and visual culture. So that's an example of it, a famous saying and image too.
It's fascinating on the website how you go into a lot of detail about the history, the origin of the artwork or the object, and then how it's used today, what it means. It is a great insight. I'm thinking of my trips to the Ismailovsky market. I have all this, piles of stuff, from there. So you went there. So of course, in recent times, it's become very fancy, and it's the vernissage now, right, with cafes and it's much cleaner. And when you talk to people there, did they have any nostalgia for what it was before, when it was a much more basic market where they just came and it wasn't very luxurious?
That's really interesting. I know that I did some reading also about the market, and it came up in the reading, and to some of the people we talked to said that it was when it was more informal. Sometimes people would just come, the artisans would come, and for this human interaction like that in some ways was also valuable, maybe even more so than selling this or that. They missed, some people did miss that a little bit, like when it was just, there was more, it wasn't so thronged with tourists, and
Right.
it wasn't so much about the commercial aspect of it, but also just about the interaction. So that did come up a bit.
um so in this series, we're talking about how Russian culture influenced Soviet culture, and we see some examples of that connection between past and future in Russia with these objects. Um, what are some examples of how Russian culture influenced Soviet culture in the work you've done? And one of the things I'm thinking about is the influence of sacred objects in Tarkovsky. I know you've done some work on that. Can you talk a little bit about that connection to the past and the new Soviet present?
Yeah, definitely. So one of my favorite classes to teach is about Russian history through film. And one of the films we watch early on, because it goes in this chronological order of Russian history. So we watch the film Andrei Rublev. And so in this film, we see Tarkovsky showing the creation of sacred objects, including a bell and then icons as well. So this image is from the bell casting scene toward the end of the film. And so there's so much to say about it, but just a couple of things. How it's and this is other scholars have noted this, that there's something about the way in which this scene plays out. We see the incredibly difficult labor that goes into creating this bell. And we see people working collectively and how it could not come into being without that collective labor. Some people see the influence of socialist realism there. And I think, yeah, absolutely. It is a movie of its time. It's late 1970s. And no, sorry, like late 1960s. But that emphasis is, you can say, is in the good context. I think it's also about how filmmaking is a collective endeavor. It has to be, in order to, the film has to come into being only through the work of a collective. So I think Tarkovsky's gesturing is that as well. But the scene is also very special because for Andrei Rublev, he's at this, when the bell is being made, he's in a crisis. He's stepped away from his art. He's in a period of artistic muteness. He's killed a man. He's killed a man in order to defend a defenseless woman. Nevertheless, he's in kind of a crisis and he's not making art. But after the bell, and then there's a question of whether this bell is going to ring, and if it doesn't ring, the bell maker will have his head cut off. So when it rings, it's very powerful, and the bell maker is a young man. He just sort of breaks down in tears. And Andrea goes to him and hugs him and starts to speak, which he hasn't been speaking for years, but he speaks to him, and he's so inspired that this young man made this miracle happen that Andre decides he's going to paint again, and bring something into the world that is positive and beautiful to offset the terrible things in the world. And so the film ends with this incredible color sequence where the camera is just following the details of Rublev's Old Testament Trinity icon. Just different images from it that remind us of images we've seen in the film, but in black and white. And those black and white images were images often of suffering and despair. And those images now at the end, they take on color. They become elevated and redeemed through art. So, and we see too, the camera is not shying away from how damaged the icon is over the centuries. The time has it's suffered over time, but that makes it that much more amazing, right? That the icon has survived. And I think Tarkovsky is saying something there too about the endurance of human beings through this icon and trying to, say something about human endurance as well.
Did he film the actual icon?
The actual Trinity,
Yeah.
he was, yeah. So he had access to it, yeah. And so it's incredible to watch that sequence again. And there's also this choral music playing in the background. It's very intense, and then you see, and it's a kind of also defamiliarization of the icon to see it in that way. But it's almost kind of like retelling the story of the film in this other way, and making us see those images in a new light. Yeah.
You've also done some work on the dialogue between Dostoevsky and Zamyatin and the influences of Dostoevsky on Zamyatin's novel We. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I can definitely. So I'm interested in literary dialogue, and including how 19th century texts then inform 20th century texts and the Russian texts in particular. So, in my teaching and in my writing, I talk about Zamyatin and what Zamyatin got from Dostoevsky. So in Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, the underground man is very critical of the Crystal Palace. He says he insults it. He says he wants to make an insulting gesture at it. Fig of Karmani. He wants to make a fig in his pocket at this Crystal Palace. So the question is, like, what is this Crystal Palace? What issue does he have with it? And so he's referring to a couple of things. The Crystal Palace originally was in 1851. The Crystal Palace was the location of the World's Fair in London. It was this enormous glass structure within which different nations were displaying their technological prowess and their achievements. And it was in some ways this sort of celebration of consumerism too, and technology, industrial capitalism, all of these things. And then Chernyshevsky, who wrote the Bible of the Revolutionaries, What is to be Done, was very influenced by this Crystal Palace and also by the utopian socialist Fourier's idea of the phalanstery as a sort of communal feature home, again, using a lot of glass, creating kind of a utopian society even through its physical structure, this building, right? So all of this utopian potential of glass architecture influences Chernyshevsky. So he creates the Crystal Palace in his novel that appears in the dream of Vera Pavlova, the protagonist. And it's the new people of the future will live in this Crystal Palace. So Dostoevsky is arguing with Chernyshevsky. He's very bothered by this vision of the future. And he sees like, so I'm going to quote from what I wrote in my book about it. So Dostoevsky's attacking a set of concepts, right? When he attacks the Crystal Palace, he is attacking the denial of free will, advent of industrial capitalism, false unity, and the triumph of materialism over spirituality. So all of these things. Meanwhile, in the beginning of the 20th century, glass becomes this utopian building material par excellence in many countries, and in Russia too. And the idea is that if you live in these perfectly glass buildings, the transparency of them will have a moral effect on the people inside and the people outside. It'll create better people. And this is taken very seriously. And then there's a lot of enthusiasm, like I said. And then in 1921, Zamyatin writes We, world's first dystopia. And he is building on Dostoevsky's ideas and his suspicion towards glass as something that he associates with a sinister side of modernity, that with technology that enables mass surveillance and control. But he really goes over the top of Zamyatin. Everything is made of glass in his world. It's not just the buildings. Streets are made of glass. Clothing is made of glass. Furniture, just everything. There's no escaping from this transparency. But Zamyatin doesn't just talk, and this is why I love what I love about the novel, that the Zamyatin doesn't just talk about glass as something that can oppress us, but he also talks about its playful qualities, that it refracts and reflects what we see. And so that optical playfulness, it sparks the human imagination, right? And we know that it does because glass kind of influences how we see and how we think. And you see that in literature. And if glass sparks the human imagination, that can help us imagine, a better and freer world too. So I think that aspect of it also appears in the novel.
So does the glass transparency make people better people?
Does it actually in the novel?
Yes.
No, I would say not. I would say
not.
no. I would say no. It doesn't quite work that way.
How was that novel received at that time?
Well, it was the first novel to be censored in the Soviet Union by Glavlit. So it was received critically, but then it still got around in manuscript and in translation. And we know George Orwell read it. He wrote a review of a translation of We, and so big influence on 1984. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about your current project. You're writing a book called Knife Imitates Art: Creativity and Crime in Russian Culture, and you've already published some work on this topic, but you're still researching it. But from what I understand, you started this project about 10 years ago in Moscow, and you were examining old Russian newspapers, which must have been thrilling to see newspapers up close. From Petrograd during the revolution. Can you tell us about that research and what you discovered?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I've been thinking about crime in Russian culture for a while. Actually, when I was still in grad school, I taught a class called Wrongdoing in Russian Literature, and that was sort of the beginning of it. But when I was in Petrograd, I was in the town of Khimki, outside of Moscow, and there's a library there. You can physically touch these newspapers from Petrograd, 1918. So I felt really like lucky to be able to do that. So I knew there was a crime wave in Petrograd right after the revolution. In fact, after the February Revolution already is when it began. And I wanted to see how it was being covered. And I found these political cartoons, and I photographed a bunch of them because I thought that there's something here that I want to dig into. These are cartoons, and I'll talk a little bit about both of these. They're trying to use humor to make sense of this, just a terror and chaos of those times when there was just the utter breakdown in the law and order. So So the cartoon on the left is part of a series called Contemporary Частушки or Современные Частушки, like a Частушки of our time, which are these sort of racy rhyming folk couplets. This one's about налетчик, which means a robber, more specifically a raider, someone who raids people's apartments, say. Or in fact, in the poem, it says, Я летаю будто летчик и по лавкам и домам. So I fly like a летчик as an aviator. The word налетчик has that root of flying, right? And so the Russian kind of riffs on that. The налетчик flies like an aviator, swooping down on homes and shops. Gives even, it's funny because the drawing is this very kind of silly caricature with all this money falling out of the guy's pockets, but he gets this certain kind of superpower, right? That he's able to just like swoop down. He's flying like an aviator, attacking these homes and shops. So I found that to be curious. And then the cartoon on the right is called Rokovой costume, or the fatal costume. I think it's really brilliant. So what happens there is in the first panel, there's this wealthy man who's being shot point blank in the face. And the person shooting him, what he says is, "Попили нашу кровушку," you drank our blood long enough. And this is this idea of the affluent as bloodsuckers. I've seen it going back as far as like 17th century during uprisings of like Razin and those massive like sort of uprisings already. You're hearing that kind of discourse. So he shoots him. He puts on his, and then he says, "Переоденусь, let me put on these clothing." So he puts on the affluent clothing, and immediately he's shot in the face by another robber who says the same thing. "You drank our blood." Enough of that. And then he says, "Переоденусь," he puts on the clothing. And underneath the captions like that, we can continue. You can imagine that this theme can continue ad infinitum. So what is this saying about the redistribution of wealth? It's not solving the problem, right? If Bolsheviks claim that economic inequality is the root of all crime, and so once that's eradicated, crime will end. And then this cartoon is in a way playing with that idea. So, yeah.
And so tell us about how this became sort of the nucleus of this project, looking at crime and how it's expressed in Russian literature, this connection between creativity and crime.
Yeah, and it's maybe a kind of scandalous connection because creativity we think is very positive and crime is negative. And why should we put them together? But I think for me, I'm thinking of a couple things. I think crime itself once it's becomes the subject of cultural production, it sparks creativity. And then there's also sometimes there's a kind of ingenuity to crime that maybe even authors will highlight. Sometimes they see a connection between criminals and artists because of this idea of crossing boundaries, breaking rules, this very romantic idea of sort of a real artist is someone who transgresses. So that's certainly in the works as well. But I think also in the Russian case, I'm very interested in how artists have been, who've stepped over the line have been punished by the state. And like we see that actually with Dostoevsky, who we talked about a little bit before, who experienced then, he was, sent to hard labor, experienced that firsthand. And then he wrote these brilliant novels about crime, working through these really important ethical issues and issues about, state power and what does an individual do, when they want to be free, and how can they be free, and does freedom and crime go together? In some ways, I think that that's a motif that comes up a lot in, what I've seen in Russian literature over the years. So yeah, and but there are other. I can give other examples too of like some of the things I'm working on in the project.
You had mentioned Chekhov.
Yeah. Okay. So I can mention Chekhov. Yeah. So this is actually in connection with the idea of art. Can crime be a form of art? So in Chekhov has this novella, really a novel called The Shooting Party, Drama na Охоте, and in it, I see a question. And in it, it takes the form of a manuscript. So this man comes to he's a former criminal investigator. He comes to the narrator, who's an editor, who's basically like Chekhov, right? He comes to the narrator and says, "I have this manuscript. Could you publish it? It's really great." And you see that in the manuscript, there's a story of a murder, and there are parts of the manuscript that are crossed out, and you see just like dots in the story. And then you also see footnotes from the editor as he's starting to suspect that the person who wrote this narrative is actually the murderer himself. And you see this like power struggle within the manuscript. And at the end, he's, the editor accuses the person of committing murder. But we see like very similar things happening in Nabokov's novel Despair, and which is also a form of a manuscript that's been tinkered with by a narrator who kind of left traces of his condemnation of the original. The author, who again, in both cases, it's someone who committed a crime and sees their crime as a work of art, as a great way to, and so they think of art as something that gives them power and influence, and they think of their victims as just some artistic material that they can manipulate at will. And so in that article, I talk about dehumanization and as something that's an essential component of these murders, but also how, in a way, Chekhov and Nabokov, they're trying to do something they're constructing a reader who's kind of like a curious reader detective, who's going to grapple with these texts and figure out what actually happened and come to a certain kind of moral realization about actually, not dehumanizing others. That's like maybe a very old school interpretation, but I really think it's true. I do think both Chekhov and Nabokov sometimes kind of step forward as teachers and want to, lead their readers into a more ethical direction. Yeah.
Not unlike Dostoevsky.
Yeah, not unlike, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
and I mean the example of crime, influencing the art. I mean, that he used an actual crime committed in Paris as sort of the basis for Crime and Punishment. So is that another example of how artists would take actual crimes and then create art around that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been said about Dostoevsky that he took sort of what's called boulevard prose, like sort of like the very kind of trashy detective writing, and elevated it, turned it into high art. But yes, he was reading the press, he was going to trials and even kind of intervening in some of the trials. And then he was just taking this raw material and turning it into something that was didn't just speak to its own time, but continues to speak now to other times. I want to share, like, I had a student who, when we were reading Crime and Punishment, he said to me, he said about Dostoevsky, he really gets me, it's just great. Like, he could get, because of what Raskolnikov was going through, the struggles he's going through, this student could relate to that. He hadn't committed crime, but he had made mistakes. I hope, but he had made mistakes in life, and he was thinking, is there any way back from that? And well, it's just so yeah, I guess art, this, in a sense, of something that's more universal, that continues to be this source for people to think about their own lives, and make sense of them, is like, yeah, Dostoevsky took that raw material and did that.
And is this use of or this connection between creativity and crime, I wouldn't say it's unique to Russia, but what have you found that is unique about the Russian literature use of this connection?
Well, actually, I can not so much literature, but I can talk about the jumpers a little bit, as like that is an example of something kind of unique. But
Yes.
and I'll come back to literature. Okay, so
Beautiful.
yeah, so
I just so happen to have a picture of the jumpers.
yeah, so I'm researching crime in early Soviet Russia, and I came upon this reference to a band of robbers operating in Petrograd and other cities in the wake of the revolution, and they're using theatricality as a weapon. They are dressed as the living dead. They're wearing like stilts or sometimes springs on their shoes that allow them to move about quickly and look terrifying. They're wearing shrouds and glowing masks, and they are basically frightening people, passersby, into giving them their outerwear and their jewelry. And so they came to be known as poprigunciki, or jumpers. And there's a lot of urban legends about them. They're museum exhibits, press coverage, and they show up in fiction and film too. So this is a still. This is not a historical document, but it's a still from a film called Dostoyanie Respubliki, the Property of the Republic, old 1970s Soviet film, really great film, kind of like this adventure film that's about a art heist. Really, it's like there's this art collection that belongs to a noble family that gets requisitioned by Bolsheviks, then it gets stolen. And in this scene, there's a man walking with a wrapped kind of painting. You can see him with it under his arm, and he gets attacked in the middle of the night by these poprogunchiki. The one on the left is like jumping down from the top of the building, and they kind of look here like clowns. They're but also in other ways when they're represented, they're quite frightening. So, but in this film, this is just like one example of. So, what I want to say is like the jumpers are really interesting to me because they incorporated artistry into their crimes. Everybody else. One thing I didn't mention is around this time, there's a lot of masquerading going on. People are committing crimes dressed as figures of authority. In Petrograd, they're like saying, "We're the police. We're commissars." We're officials coming to, confiscate your property. So there's that. Some people are dressed as military figures. So there's that kind of masquerading. But the jumpers took it in a completely different direction with dressing up as the undead. And so I'm curious about that aspect of like the context for what they were doing.
When was this crazy crime wave that coincided with the revolution? When was it tamped down? Because I think of Bolshevik Revolution, the eventual establishment of Soviet power, and in that image, I can't imagine jumpers and people dressing up as police and people flying in and stealing all the contents of a store. Why was that? Was it more freewheeling than we would have expected for a revolutionary period? And how are these jumpers dispensed with?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so initially the crime wave begins after the February Revolution, and then when Bolsheviks take power, they're unable to control it for a while. And I learned a lot from there's a book called Crime and Punishment in Revolutionary Petrograd by Tsuyoshi Hasegawa. I learned a lot. I recommend that to everybody, but learned a lot from him. And what argument he makes is that in a way, Bolsheviks had to take really draconian measures to crack down on this crime wave. And once they did, it kind of never went away. Right. But because it was discrediting, right? The crime wave was discrediting their own leadership, their own regime, and that they couldn't bring law and order to the streets. So as far as the jumpers, it wasn't until 1920, so they began to operate in 1918. Not until 1920 is their band arrested. And the way they're arrested is, the story goes that the agents of the police dressed as affluent muzhiki, like peasants, and supposedly were walking around with bags of food and boasting about how much wealth they had. And so it was like human bait, and they invited the jumpers to attack them, and then they arrested them. And apparently, again, from what I've seen, there was a resurgence of these jumpers, first of all in Moscow during NEP, and then again during World War II even. There was, yes. And so I'm still trying to investigate that, but it seems like there was this like second coming of them during the wartime.
The jumpers.
Yeah.
This seems to be something that's not real, much publicized or talked about. I've never heard of these jumpers. What were they in World War II? I mean, again, as criminal gangs during World War II?
Again, as criminal gangs. Yeah, again, as criminal gangs. And so the narratives that I've seen, some of them say they were put up to it by German like intelligence. And it was like they were like already criminals, recidivists, but they were used to, again, undermine morale. It's like this is some of the arguments say, and others say this hasn't been verified. So to the extent that it was a foreign plot, I'm not sure yet. I don't know. But this is some of the narratives that are out there. Yeah. To discredit, the leadership, to say the Soviet power hasn't been able to fully control its criminality. Right. Yeah. So.
We have a question. Do you see any correlations between crime and creativity today?
Oh, okay. Yeah. I saw that one. Yeah.
Is that something you're looking at, or?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I'm very interested in it. I think I will say maybe just, I think it's, how can I put it? I think that there are, whenever our art becomes something that is political, then it can, then that's, I think, maybe an intersection where that happens, where sometimes maybe art is, its creativity can not maybe set out to be criminal, but it can be criminalized. So I've definitely thought about that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's other examples are like maybe not in the Russian case, but I don't know if this is just the case that I came across. There was a man. He's still around. He's a tightrope walker. Who once he was famous in the 1970s. He walked between the Twin Towers,
Yeah.
in New York City while they still existed. He walked on a tightrope between those buildings, and he became very famous for that because it was incredibly risky action. And he he wrote a book called Creativity and Crime, where in fact he was arrested after he did that walk because it was just illegal. You couldn't do such things. But for him it was still really important to create this work of performance art, and the people who saw him do it were just, they felt like they saw something very special and astounding, and just kind of elevated their existence. So his book is called Creativity and Crime. And I will say too, in the Russian context, I read recently about a movie that came out about something similar, like a young couple who were doing these scaling of buildings, like very high buildings all around the world, and they filmed themselves doing that. They're like skywalkers.
Yeah.
And so
Which was
they
made by a native Russian filmmaker.
yeah, I just remembered about that. So in some ways, I think there is an interesting intersection too of like what they're. I mean, it's also, of course, it's not just the art. It's there's commerce involved. No, but I guess that was always the case, right? Artists always have to make money, but they're, I think, making art and breaking the law to do it. But in order to, like, they feel like it's still worth doing.
That's a great segue. Breaking the law to make money. Um, so on this topic of crime and creativity and the connection, is the example of Dostoevsky's influence on Ilfin Petrov, and specifically on the 12 Chairs. Can you talk to us about how Dostoevsky influenced Ilfin Petrov?
Yeah. So this is what I think. I like to look at literary form, right? I'm very interested in like super close reading. And what I see in these two novels, and hardly anyone's really talked about the crime and punishment in relation to the 12 chairs. I found maybe a couple sentences in another scholar, but not much more than that. So, but there's this kind of structural mirroring. Okay, so Crime and Punishment, spoiler alert, begins with the murder of Raskolnikov murders a pawnbroker to obtain her hidden valuables. So in both novels, there's this illicit pursuit of wealth, right? So Raskolnikov at the beginning kills the pawnbroker, wants to get her wealth, her hidden wealth, and we don't know why he did it quite, but it seems like one of the reasons is he wants to improve the lot of his fellow man, right? He's like, all of these gifted young people are, they're starving and they're without any means to, do important things in the world. So he steals this, he steals this wealth. Of course, he never does anything with it, but there's this idea, right? Helping the less fortunate. Now in the 12 Chairs, the character of Vorobyaninov, he knows that his mother-in-law has hidden some jewels in one of 12 chairs, so he's pursuing those jewels with his co-conspirator, and he kills his co-conspirator, Ostap Bender, the beloved cultural figure. Right? He kills him on the eve of what he thinks will be their discovery of the jewels. And so the murder in this case happens at the very end of the novel, but Vorobyaninov, he discovers the jewels have already been found, and they've been used to build this beautiful club for a brand new club, so bettering the lot of Vorobyaninov's fellow man. So the lives of many are transformed with the redistribution of an old woman's wealth. So it's the kind of the thing that happens, if you can put it this way, like the Raskolnikovs have won, right? There's like the thing that was maybe motivating, or one of the things that motivated Raskolnikov at the beginning of Crime and Punishment, comes to fruition at the end of the 12 shares. So what does that mean? That's like a very provocative parallel, right? And I think, Ilfin Petrov, they're loyal. They believed in the whole communist project. Nevertheless, you can do that. You can be that and still have a novel that raises certain questions about, this was more crime being generated by the revolution rather than less. I would say yes. What are these ethical boundaries the Russian revolutionaries had to cross in the name of their ideals? So I think the novel's raising those questions.
A question we have is, how did writers after the revolution stay connected to the idea of those who came before
Mhm.
them,
Mhm.
the ideas of those who came before them. How were those ideas transferred to
Mhm.
Soviet writers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think that writers, the classics, right, were still taught, celebrated. Different aspects of them were, maybe officially presented in a particular way. Like Gogol, I it's find it funny that Gogol gets presented as a fighter for social justice because he was actually very conservative. Nevertheless, you can find in Gogol, you can find an exposure of wealth inequality. Absolutely, it's actually one of the things I'm kind of looking into right now. Um, because there's in Gogol's Overcoat, there's an episode of street crime that's very, very important that I don't think people look at all that much, but I would like to. So yeah, I think that the writers are, continue a lot of the Tsarist writers are continuing to be read and taught. Now Dostoevsky, I talked to my parents, did you read Dostoevsky in school? They say no, because he was much too religious. It was very difficult to escape that content. So at least in their experience, they didn't really read Dostoevsky. So, but I imagine people found a way through manuscripts and other ways too. But it's a great question. Yeah,
And
samizdat, tamizdat, all of that. Mhm.
and I know that Master and Margarita is popular with your students, and there's a there must be some connection between Gogol and Bulgakov and that dialogue. Is that do you bring that into discussions around modern or more recent Russian writers when you're teaching their books to the students? Do you have them reference like those older works to see those parallels?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think Gogol influenced a lot of people, and then Bulgakov in his turn as well, just through the way he used satire, the way he created characters who were very kind of over the top and grotesque in some ways, and the magical realism that Bulgakov kind of borrows from Gogol. Yeah, I mean, I want students to think of literature as this ongoing dialogue and um, and then their own analysis of it is also part of a dialogue with people who have, analyzed literature before. So,
You've mentioned that your students in reading Crime and Punishment and Master and Margarita, they grapple with some of those issues of spirituality and these philosophical issues that come through from Bulgakov and Dostoevsky. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how your students connect with those two novels on a spiritual level or on a
yeah,
existential
yeah,
question?
for sure. Because that has surprised me in the last few years because I've had both more students who are more for whom faith is more important to them, but also students who are not necessarily identifying as religious, but are thinking about they appreciate the opportunity to think about and discuss in class the kinds of questions that come up in Dostoevsky, for example, about do we want to be free or do we want all our, do we want to be economically secure? Like what does it mean to be free? What is our responsibility to other people? Um, do we actually have any? So all of those kinds of questions and in Bulgakov as well, Bulgakov is, I mean, he's very much, he wants to show that it's a mistake to erase religion. And he lays that out for us. But I think even for students who aren't religious themselves, they understand that what he's getting at is there's a kind of orthodoxy, right, that says you can't imagine these things, right? You can't even imagine another dimension beyond the one in which we live, and that there's something fundamentally wrong with that because it's crushing the human capacity to imagine. And so students get that. They really love the Master Margarita. So it still speaks to them for those reasons.
Do you teach any other Bulgakov stories or novellas with them?
I haven't. I know A Heart of a Dog is something that students really like that other colleagues have taught. So maybe one day.
What are your students? What do they gravitate towards the most? I mean, I know Bulgakov, Master Margarita, Crime and Punishment. What else? What else is on their agenda when they approach Russian literature?
Oh, when they approach, oh, a lot of times they just hear that this is great, but they don't know any specifics. But I would say Chekhov and Tolstoy they've really resonated a lot with my students too. And when I teach those authors, yeah, Chekhov stories, and then Tolstoy, Master and Man, I will mention we had one of our greatest discussions. And the last time I taught 19th century was of Хозяин и Работник, and the kinds of issues it raises about power relationships between people of different classes. And again, that question of responsibility to one another, and ultimately, what is this life for? Like, why are we here? Just beautiful to discuss together. So.
Well, thank you for sharing all this with us. I mean, this is what life is for. This is why we're here, to talk about this and learn from it. I'm sure your students are very lucky to have you as their professor and introducing them to these great cultural works. Thank you very much to you, Julia, and all of you who joined us today. And we'll see you next time on the Culture Connection.
Thank you, Michael.